Hi everybody, Darren here. I'm in the Camosun Pipe Trades Cross Connection Lab and we're testing the RP assembly today. So first thing I would do is go through all my pre-test procedures, notify, identify, inspect, and observe. I've also asked for permission to shut water off today, and I've recorded all the information about the assembly on my test form. So I'm going to start flushing the test valves. I'm going to get a flow through number 4 first, to keep some flow through the assembly while I flush the other test valves. And so I'm going to open one and flush it out and then close it. Open and close 2, 3, and then close 4. Just ensure that I have all the test valves closed and there are no leaks. I'm going to hook up the gauge, start to bleed the gauge. It's got my high side hose to number 2. Got my low side hose to number 3. Make sure I have all my control valves off. Bleed valves are off at the moment. I'm going to open up first the test valve 3. And I'm going to bleed the low side of the gauge to the low side bleed valve. So while that's bleeding, I'm going to open up test valve 2. And open up the high side bleed. So I can bleed the high side as well. So both sides are bleeding. Both test valves are open. Once I have all the air out of the gauge, I can close the high side, then the low side bleed valves, and then I ask for permission one more time before I close shut off number 2 on the assembly. So I've isolated the assembly, the gauge is bled. I have a apparent pressure drop reading of 8.2 psid. So just unofficially on the form, I would record 8.2 psid. Now I'm going to start the relief valve test to verify the relief valve opening point. I'm going to open the high side control valve fully. Just quickly take a moment to wipe my gauge down, make sure I don't get any false readings from drips after I flush the gauge out. So I've opened the high side control valve fully, and I slowly start to open the low side control valve while I hold one hand underneath the relief valve, and I'm trying to determine the point at which the relief valve opens. So I got a drop of water on my hand at 2.6 psid was the differential pressure relief valve opening point. So I'm going to close the low side control valve only, leaving the high side open. I'm going to record the opening point as 2.6 psid, which is a pass, as the minimum is 2. Now what I have to do is check the second, verify the second check valve against back pressure and make sure that it's closed tight. So I start doing that by establishing a flow through the bypass hose, opening the bypass control valve a little bit. So just get a little bit of flow through there. Just to keep that line purged out, I can throttle that back a little bit while I attach it to test valve 4. Then I close the bypass control valve. Now what I'm going to do is open up test valve 4, get ready to put back pressure on check valve 2. I have to reestablish the zone of reduced pressure by bleeding the low side until I come above my apparent psid reading from earlier, which was 8.2 psid. So once I come above 8.2, I can reseat the low side bleed valve. Now I have test valve 4 open, and I've bled the gauge, so now all I have to do is open up the bypass control valve You'll sometimes notice a little bit of discompression, as we just saw there. It dropped about a couple of tenths there. So we see some discompression as the zone pressure actually becomes a little closer to the upstream pressure. There's a slight change in the differential, but as long as we don't drop to the relief valve opening point and we get a steady gauge reading for 2 minutes, then we can record that as check valve 2 closed tight. So all I say is closed tight. There's no reading to take at this point. Now I'm going to check the actual pressure drop across the first check valve with back pressure on the second check. Everything else as is. All I have to do is bleed the low side control one more time, coming above the apparent PSID of 8.2 in this case. Reseat the low side control valve, low side bleed valve. And this is my actual pressure drop on check valve 1. And I want a steady gauge reading for at least 2 minutes, so I would time that for 2 minutes. As long as the gauge has not moved within that 2 minutes, I can say that that is the actual PSID across check valve 1. So if after 2 minutes it was still 8.4, I'd record that as 8.4. So 8.4 PSID is the actual PSID on check valve 1 minus the relief valve opening point. Gives me a buffer of 5.8 PSID, which is above 3, which is great. So last thing I have to do is take the static line pressure at the time of my test. So I close all the bleed valves, close all the test valves. Remove the hoses from the gauge. Remove the hoses from the assembly. I move my high side hose down to test valve 1. Close all my control valves. Make sure all valves are closed. Open up test valve 1. Bleed the gauge through the high side bleed valve. And I use my calibrated static pressure gauge to record the line pressure. So I'd record 40 psi gauge at the time of test. So that completes the test. I'll just have to shut down test valve 1. Remove all my hoses. Last chance to wipe down the assembly, just make sure everything's in good order. Verify the position of all your test valves. And just before we put the assembly back into service, we ask for permission to turn the water back on. Okay, so once we've done that, we can say we've completed the test.